Practicing painting techniques with watercolor paint and tempera paint. Remember your name and teacher code. Next, you'll fold your paper. You can do this with both pieces at the same time if your fingers are strong enough. First, just fold the bottom to the top, and then you'll do that again, bottom to the top. So you'll have this kind of long, skinny piece here. Next, we're not going to quite fold it in half. You're going to fold it about halfway, and then you're going to check to see that it's about the same size as the top half. This will hopefully create relatively similar sized boxes. When you open it, you should have 12 boxes. If not, it's okay. Just try again. Or if you have to, just kind of make some light pencil lines. Then you will label 1 sheet tempera paint and 1 sheet watercolor paint. Then you will add appropriate labels to each box. Don't worry, I'll pause the video right here so you can get caught up. We'll start by practicing with tempera paint. You're going to follow along with the video and just do your best to keep up if you can. Make sure that you have some items to dry your paintbrush with because you'll definitely need that. If you prefer paper towel or a small sponge, that's perfectly fine. I'm gonna start with the dry brush because right now my brush is very dry. And I'm just gonna get a little bit of paint on the tip of my brush, and I'm gonna use that dry brush to paint with this technique inside of the square labeled dry brush. And we're gonna keep going with this process with each of the different squares. Please remember to thoroughly rinse your brush every time you switch colors because we're sharing this paint with our table and other classes. Next, we will do the wet paper technique. So you're gonna get a pretty visible puddle of water on your paper. And then after you see that there's a puddle on there, while it's still puddly, you wanna make sure that puddle's still visible. You're going to add just a little bit of paint and you'll notice it really spreads out. If you want, you can even try and add another color to see what happens as well. Next, you will fill in a shape. Really any shape that you would like to create. I chose a square because I felt like I could probably keep a little bit more precise lines for this small space. So any shape you would like, and then just carefully fill it in using the tip of your brush. I'm going to use the same shape, but this time I'm going to fill in the shape and then I'm going to outline it with a separate color. It's very important to keep more of a precise line by using the very tippy top of your brush, and you're not using very much pressure. And I decided I'm not going to rinse my brush for this one because I already have a nice color on there, and you're going to kind of dot or dab your paint, not the dance move. We're dabbing the paint, not our bodies. Grab another color if you want. This is a great way to create texture and some interesting blending. For overpainting, it's up to you if you were working on a project whether or not you wanted the paint to be dry. In this case, for this practice, it will not be. So I'm starting with this turquoise and I'm just painting just kind of a little area, and then I'm going to rinse my brush really thoroughly and I'm going to paint white directly on the already wet paint. You can change up this technique a little bit, as I said, if you let the first layer dry, but maybe you want them to kind of slightly blend a little bit. For this graffito, you probably want to pick a darker color so it's a little easier to see. So it's just start by kind of laying down a relatively thick layer of paint. You don't want it to be blobby, but you want it to be on there kind of heavy. And then just take the end of your paintbrush and you can mark into it, which this process is called sgraffito. You can also actually do this into clay. To create streaks of paint, you'll use the very tip of your brush and you're just going to kind of make quick brush strokes. You might need to add water to your brush. For blending, you're going to basically overlap colors just a little bit. It does take certainly some practice because you have to kind of figure out how much paint you need, but you overlap the colors just a little bit, and often you have to rinse your brush and then return to the first color you started with. Be really, really gentle when you're doing this process. If you push down or scrub too much with your brush, it doesn't work out so well. So that's why we're practicing. Next, we'll do some scumbling. So pick a color and you're just making a circular motion with your brush. It's almost like you're creating like a cloud-like texture by just repeating circles. And you'll notice if you have more or less paint that this technique will also appear different too. Next, you're just going to practice making some textures, so maybe use a dry brush and kind of squiggle back and forth. You could create some kind of grass strokes or just patting the top of your brush to create dots, or maybe you want them to be a little more fluffy like the dabbing above. Just try some experimenting in this little space and see what you can come up with. For our final box, we will use streaks of paint and you'll blend them by kind of overlapping them. So just as you overlapped above in blending, you're going to do something similar, but your brush strokes are kind of quick and wispy and you're overlapping. You're still going to be very gentle though when you're blending the paint. For our second painting technique practice, we will use liquid watercolors. Something else to keep in mind for future projects is that I do have different kinds of watercolor type paint that is available to you. We will be using liquid watercolors for this practice, but I do have some pan liquid watercolors in the plastic white trays you see, and then I also have tempera cake paints, which are the kind of circular puck-shaped paint. It is basically the same paint that you used in your previous practice called tempera paint, but it is a hard dry version of that. And you use it very similar to the pan watercolors because you have to add water in order for them to work. These are all great options and they all give you different outcomes. I'm going to begin using the dry brush method because my brush is relatively dry before I start, and just kind of go back and forth gently, and you'll notice the paint, it kind of wants to stop, but it does create a really cool texture. Next, I'm going to make sure my paper is nice and puddly, so add some water on there and there should be a visible puddle, just like when we use the tempera paint. It likes to soak in quick when we use construction paper. While it's still puddly, grab a little bit of your color or two and add it on top and watch it spread out really quick. Then next, this is what we've basically done a lot of times where we just paint with our watercolor onto the dry paper. A flat wash is very similar to just painting on dry paper, but you're, I guess, paying extra careful attention to making sure that the color is consistent by gently painting over areas you may have already painted. So if you look above where I painted on the dry paper, you can see that it kind of starts to get gradually lighter. And here, I'm slowly and gently painting over the same area multiple times. Be gentle, like I said, otherwise you'll end up with a hole in your paper. And what I want to do is make that color consistent all the way across the space that I'm painting in it. Next, I'm going to create a gradient wash or a graded wash. All that means is I'm just creating different kinds of values. So you start with your darkest of your color, and then as you add more water, it will gradually get lighter and lighter. Sometimes you might have to rinse and blot your brush so that you get that extra paint color off, and then keep adding more water that way too. This is one that definitely takes some practice, but that's why we're doing this. Next, we'll practice some blending. You'll start with one color and then you'll overlap with another color. Blending on construction paper is a bit tricky, I will say. Watercolor paper is much better for this process because it doesn't want to soak in quite so quick, but watercolor paper, it's very expensive and it's probably not best for practice. If anything, this will just challenge you to be better at blending. As you can see, I'm rinsing my brush and I'm grabbing the color I started with and gently overlapping. Sometimes I even add a little bit of water. You kind of keep rotating back and forth between the colors until you get the effect blended how you would like. For the glazing technique, I'm going to kind of use a wet brush to dip into the watercolor because I want it to be a little more watered down and transparent. And I'm just going to add one or two random shapes there, and then I'm going to leave it alone because I want this to soak in and dry, which we know doesn't take too long. So we'll return to this. Just add a shape or two of your choice, and then we'll move to the next box for a moment. Next, we'll practice with the kind of lift out or lift off paint technique. This is a little tricky again on construction paper because our paint wants to soak in immediately. However, if it's on there pretty dark and it's still pretty puddly, you can use a paper towel to soak up some extra color that you may not want on there. Just experiment, see what you can come up with and see how it works. Maybe if you move quicker, you may be able to soak up the colors a little bit more than I did. Now I'm going to return to the square with the glazing technique, and I'm going to use another light color, and I'm going to paint with another kind of transparent shape on top of the shapes that I already added there. Next, we will try out the salt technique, and this one you may not see the effects of it today because often we have to let the paint dry and it creates these cool little kind of sparkly white specks. So grab any color of your choice, probably one that's a little bit darker, and you're going to need a little mini salt shaker at your table if you don't have one. So add a little puddle of paint there, and then while it's still puddly, very important that it's puddly or it might not work as good, you're going to gently tap a tiny bit of salt on there, and then when you see these, when they're dry, you'll get to see the cool effect that salt creates. Next, you're going to practice feathering out. This is basically like creating the gradient wash, except for you're starting in the middle with a dot, and then you'll add water around it, like a circle around it, and it'll gradually start to spread out. It's really neat if you overlap this and use multiple colors, but it definitely takes practice because that paint does not want to cooperate. It kind of wants to go its own direction. So try out a couple different colors, do a little bit of overlapping, and see how it goes for you. Yet again, this is where construction paper is a little bit frustrating for some of this practice because the paint wants to soak in so very quickly. For the splatter paint technique, just get a little paint on your brush and gently tap the metal part of your brush to splatter the paint. For the final square, you'll create a crayon resist. That is where you create crayon lines. You have to press relatively hard, not to the point where you break the crayon, but you want a nice bold line, and then paint with watercolor on top of it. Sometimes liquid watercolor wants to soak in on the construction paper yet again, so you might have to use a paper towel to soak up some extra paint, and even adding extra water to your brush helps as well.